Okay, good morning, everyone. All right, so welcome back. Okay, so today's lecture, we're going to first start off with understanding some scheduling concepts. All right, and once we're done with that, I'm going to move on to the idea of mutex and how mutex actually um, plays a part, a very critical part in our OS-based uh, programs. Okay, and then I will also talk about some matters relating to the project as well as the midterm next week. Okay, uh, so you will probably hear quite a bit of some background noise because there's some construction going on nearby. Okay, so it is a bit loud. Okay, but I will try to talk a bit louder. Okay, so you can all hear me. Okay, so today's first topic will be on the scheduling. All right, so last lesson we got ourselves introduced to the state transition diagram. Okay, and basically what we saw was that when we create a task, okay, the task can transition from one state to another state depending on the activities that are going on. Okay, and one of the key things we saw was over here in the ready queue. Okay, what you have is you have a list of tasks that are in the ready queue: task 1, task 2, task 3, and so on. And the highest priority task will be selected to transition to the run state. Okay, so the job of or the person or entity in charge of transitioning tasks, okay, from the ready state to the running state and so on, is this person called the scheduler. Okay, so the scheduler is in charge of looking at all these tasks and deciding who should transition, okay, between the different states, okay, from the ready to the run. So in today's this set of slides, we are going to be looking at some of these scheduling policies and how we can perform some analysis uh, on how our code may work, okay, given a particular scheduling approach that we are using in the system. Okay, so the whole idea is to sort of understand this scheduling algorithm. Okay, and the whole idea is a scheduling algorithm is supposed to allocate the processor to allow the various tasks to have some computational time so that effectively I can meet all my deadlines. All right, so we will consider the case as similar to what we are doing in the lab, which is a single processor and multiple tasks. Okay, so let's look at this example first. Okay, now I have 3 tasks. Okay, and in these 3 tasks, I have set aside some execution time. So task A has 10 milliseconds execution time, task B 20 milliseconds, and task B 30 milliseconds. Okay, at the same time, I have also set aside a deadline. All right, that means the moment task A is uh, sort of uh, initiated, you have to complete the task within 50 milliseconds. Similarly, task B 20 milliseconds and task C 60 milliseconds. Okay, and of course, in a real life scenario, a lot of things are very dynamic, and some of the tasks may be in the ready state, some of the tasks may be in the block state, and so on. Okay, but in our case, okay, we will consider some theoretical examples. So the first thing we're going to say is that all the tasks are ready at time 0. Okay, all the tasks are ready at time 0. So if all the tasks are ready at time 0, and let's say I select my algorithm in this order, that means I will do task A first, followed by task B, and followed by task C. Then what will happen? Okay, so task A takes 10 milliseconds. So one block here represents 10 milliseconds, followed by task B, 20 milliseconds, followed by task C. All right, so that is the sequence of the operation. Okay, but now let's look at the deadlines that we have. Okay, so we know that task A deadline was 50 milliseconds. Okay, so that part is okay. So this is 50. Okay, this point here. Task C was 60. and task B was 20 over here. Okay, so if you follow this sequence, task B will miss the deadline. All right, so that is not allowed. All right, that is an issue for our system. So how if we swap things around and then we say, okay, why don't I do BAC first or BAC in this order? So BAC, okay. And now if I look at the deadlines, all right, you will see that task B satisfy the deadline, task A satisfy the deadline, and task C also satisfy the deadline. Okay, so all the tasks can meet the deadline. Okay, and again we can try another sequence BCA. So if I try BCA and then I examine the deadlines, you will see that task B meets the deadline. Okay, task A does not meet the deadline, will miss the deadline, and task C will meet the deadline. Okay, so you can see that the same three tasks with a preset execution time and deadline, when I try different order of execution, okay, one of them seems to work, okay, in terms of meeting the deadline, the others do not. All right, so of course this is just randomly we are trying a sequence. All right, but now we're going to understand the concepts behind it and how we can actually make sure we can allocate uh, tasks in a order with an algorithm that the deadlines can be met. Okay, so to do the analysis, like what I mentioned just now, we need to make some assumptions which may not generally apply in some cases. Okay, so just like for your project that you are working on, some of the tasks may be periodic, some of the tasks may be aperiodic. All right, for example, when I activate my LED task, all right, so that sequence that is going to run will happen in a periodic manner, okay, while my robot is moving. Okay, similarly for the audio task, it may also play at a particular interval, okay, once it starts to move. But the motor task is not considered periodic, correct? It all depends on the command that you receive. Okay, as and when you receive a command, then you activate the motor task. Okay, if not, you do not activate the motor task. Okay, so some of the analysis may apply, some may not be applicable to the project, and in some other cases as well. Okay, but for analysis, we will make some assumptions. Firstly, we will say that we already have a fixed number of tasks, and so we know beforehand how many tasks we're having, and we are also going to assume that all the tasks are periodic in nature. Okay, and the period does not change in time. That means if I say that task one is supposed to happen every 100 millisecond, every 100 millisecond, one instance of task one will be ready to run. Okay, so once a task instance is released, it automatically becomes ready, okay, at the beginning of the period. All right, so these are again some of the baseline assumptions so that we can do the analysis. Now, so the first thing that we need to look at is what is this worst case execution time? Okay, so this worst case execution time means the upper limit of the time that a task may take. All right, so this can vary. Okay, in some cases it might be consistent, in some cases it may vary. Okay, so for example, if I say that every time a task runs, okay, let's say my serial monitor, okay, this is my TX pin. If every time my task run I'm supposed to send out 1 byte of data, then I can say that it is quite consistent. Correct, because every time is always 1 byte of data whenever the task runs. But if let's say now my task is every time the task is triggered, I'm supposed to send out the array or all the bytes inside the array. Then it depends on how big the array is. Correct? If the array is small, I will take shorter time. If the array is large, I will take longer time. Okay. So in some cases, the task may have varying execution time. Okay, so that is where the worst case execution time comes in. So what is the worst case scenario? How big can the array get? Okay, and that your program is supposed to handle. All right, so that is the worst case execution time for any task. Okay, so as you can see here in this picture, the blue box that represents the execution time is different. So each instance has a different amount of time allocated to task 1 to complete its activity. But what you do notice is that whatever the case, task 1 must complete by the end of its period. Okay, by the end of the period, it must complete. So that is what we call the timing constraint of the deadline. Okay, and since we say that deadline, that all the tasks are periodic in nature, so generally we can assume that the deadline is the same as the period. So as long as the total worst case execution time is lesser than the period, then we say it is still able to meet the deadline. Okay, so that is the second sort of baseline we are putting in place. So worst case execution time followed by the concept of deadline and period. Okay, so these are some additional assumptions where we say the tasks are completely independent of each other. Okay, so whether a task is ready or not does not depend on other tasks. So this, of course, does not hold true for our project. Okay, simply put, if you take, for example, your task LED or your task motor and so on. Okay, so each task, okay, will have some dependency on the T brain task, correct? Because if the T brain never send any information or any signal to the motor task or LED task to activate, then all of them would have to be in some form of a block state or ready state or waiting for some information to come in. Okay, so there is always a dependency between the different tasks. Then only I can carry on running. Similarly, T motor may trigger the T LED task to carry on running as well. Okay, so there is definitely a lot of dependency in our project between the various tasks. Okay, but in our analysis here, we will take it that they are independent of each other. All right, and of course, context switching, scheduling, and so on definitely take time, but we will also ignore those time factor in this analysis. Okay, so just now we saw this worst case execution time. Now there's another aspect to this, which is the worst case response time. Okay, that means is the only difference between execution time and response time is when you talk about execution time, you say that there is no interference. That means the moment task 1 starts, it will run to completion without any form of interference. Whereas in the response time, there is a possibility that the task can be preempted by some other task or some other interrupt and so on. Okay, so you will look at this example here. Okay, when I look at worst case execution time, it all comes down to the actual code itself and the data we are dealing with and what we are trying to achieve. All right, so as long as it is within the period, then it's fine. But in the worst case response time, all right, in this example, you can see that when task 1 is running, there is a preemption by task X over here. Okay, so before task 1 can complete, another task has taken over the CPU, and after it has completed running, then only task 1 can resume. Okay, so that is the worst case response time here. Now, of course, with preemption, all right, things can become even more tricky because in the worst case execution time analysis, you may be able to hit the deadline, but the moment I am able to get preempted, all right, so in this here, when task 1 is running, task Y preempts the task 1. So task Y takes up some time, all right, and then only task 1 can resume. So by the time task 1 resumes and it can complete, it would have already missed the deadline because your period has already elapsed. Okay, so this preemption can of course affect the dynamics of a system. Okay, so that is where of course the preemptive priority driven scheduling concept comes in. So this is basically the whole idea of how RTOS is designed. Okay, so if you look at our RTX, RTOS, and other real-time operating system kernels, they are designed with this scheduling algorithm in mind. That means they have a concept of priority and preemption. The moment a higher priority task comes in, it will be able to preempt and uh, take over the CPU. Okay, so that is of course the whole fundamental of why we are able to say it is real time. Okay, so the concept of the priority comes in, and given the importance to make sure that a higher priority task will always be able to get hold of the CPU. So let's look at example here. So in this example, we have three tasks: task one, task two, task three, high, medium, and low priority. Okay, so this is high, this is medium, and this is low. So at time t equals 0, only T2 is ready. So T2 will run. Okay. And at time t equals to 15, T1 becomes ready. Okay. So since T1 is a higher priority task, it will preempt T2 and take over the CPU. Okay. And once that is done, okay, and while T1 is executing, T3 gets ready at t equals to 18. Okay. So at this point of time, what is happening? T1 is currently running, so T1 is of course higher priority, but T2 was also preempted. Right? That means T2 has not completed running, it was preempted by T1. So when T1 finishes, you will have to go back and finish off T2 first. Then when T2 is complete, finally T3 will get a chance to run. Okay, so that is the idea of preemptive priority driven scheduling. Okay, so of course now the question comes is, how do I assign priority? Okay, because since priority seems to be very critical, what is the mechanism that we have? So there are two types in which we can assign priorities. One is what we call fixed priority system. Okay, so in the fixed priority system, the priority does not change with time. All right, and in dynamic priority may change over time. Okay, so we're going to spending quite a bit of time on the fixed priority concept. All right, but of course, with fixed priority, there is another sort of issue that we will have to deal with, which is what we call priority inversion. Okay, the priority inversion problem. Okay, so this one we will cover in another lecture. Okay, but this is one of the challenges that uh, or one of the issues that we may face when we are having a fixed priority system. All right, but there is a mechanism within the OS that can actually help us to overcome it. Okay, and we will discuss this at a later time. Dynamic priority is where the priority of tasks will actually change with time. Okay, so that is there are two different ways of assigning priorities. Okay, so the first scheduling algorithm we're going to look at is what we call the RMS. So this is a very popular and widely used scheduling policy. Okay, and the concept is very simple. The priority is inversely proportional to task period. Okay, so the thinking is, if my period is very short, that means I need to run it very frequently. Okay, so since I need to run it very frequently, I should give it a higher priority. Okay, so that is the thinking behind the RMS algorithm. All right, so we have fixed priority, and the priority that we assign is based on the period. Okay, the task period. Okay, so let's look at this example here. So in this example, I have task 1, task 2, task 3. So as you can see, the period here, task 2 is the smallest. So this would be the highest priority task. Okay, followed by task 1, followed by task 3. All right, now let's look at what is going to happen here. So as we said just now, the assumption, one of the assumptions is all the tasks will be ready at time t equals to 0. So at time t equals to 0, all the tasks are ready to run. Okay, so which tasks will run first, the highest priority task. Right? So T2 will run first. Okay. So when T2 runs, it takes 1 unit of computation time. So after T2 runs, I will go to the next higher priority task. Okay. So T2 has a periodic interval of 4 units. Correct. That means that's why we put 0, 4, 8, 12, and so on. So every 4 units of time, okay, you have another instance of T2. Okay. But the moment T2 finishes, you have some free time. So the scheduler can now allocate the next task in the ready queue. So the next task in the ready queue is T1. So T1 will be able to run, and that will take another 2 units of time. Okay. And then after that, I will be able to run T3. Okay. So T3 requires 2 units of time. Okay. But the moment it completes the first unit, okay, what happens? The second instance of T2 has already been launched. Okay. And since T2 is higher priority than T3, it will preempt T3 and take over the CPU. So T2 will run. Okay. But the moment T2 runs, okay, what happens after that? It does not go back to T3 because the moment T2 runs, the second instance of T1 is also launched. Okay, and T1 is higher than T3. So T1 will then run, okay, and it will finish, and then I'll be able to come back and finish up the T3. Okay, so the T3 2 units is broken up, okay, because of preemption of the higher priority task. Okay, and once T3 is done, then again I can take the next instance of T2, and after T2 at time t equals to 10, T1 will launch again, and after that at time t equals to 12, what happens? Again T2 will launch, and after that I need to wait until t equals to 15. Okay, because T1 has a periodic interval of 5. Okay, so at time t equals to 15, when T1 launches, all right, another instance, what happens? Before it can complete the another instance of T2 is already launched. So which means that I will now need to preempt T1 and run T2. Okay, and then after that I'll be able to carry on with T1, and then I move again. Okay, so from here, okay, you can see that within this time frame of t equals to 20, okay, T1, T2, and T3 all are running, and there is preemption, there's a lot of context switching and so on, but all the tasks are able to meet their deadline. Right? All the tasks are able to meet their deadline without any issue. All right, and anything after t goes to 20, you will see that it is actually a repetition from the same t equals to 0. Okay, so this is basically what we call the concept of the hyper period. All right, the hyper period is basically a section of time where you analyze the behavior of the task, and subsequently all the repetitions are actually a repeat of the hyper period only. Okay, and how do you get the hyper period? Is basically the least common multiple of the task periods. Okay, so since I have 3 tasks with period of 4, 5, and 10, the LCM is 20. Okay, and since we are dealing with periodic tasks, we can say that the schedule will repeat itself every hyper period. Okay, so why is this hyper period analysis important? Because if within one hyper period we can analyze and we can see that we do not miss any deadline. Okay, we can fulfill all the deadlines of all the tasks, then we can confidently say that the task set is schedulable, correct? Because subsequently it's just a repetition of the hyper period. Okay, so within one hyper period, I do the analysis and I can see that everything is good. There is no miss deadline. Then I can confidently say that this task set is schedulable. Okay, so that is the significance of the hyper period. Okay, so when we say a feasible schedule, that means a schedule where you can meet all the timing constraint. All right, and the scheduling algorithm is basically an approach that allows us to produce a feasible schedule. Okay, so when you say the feasible schedule, we want to create a scheduling sequence that can meet all the timing requirements, and the scheduling algorithm is the approach in which we can produce this schedule. Now, so just now in the beginning, we had this ABC task and then we tried different sequences, correct? We tried different sequences and just to get the idea, correct? And then now we looked at RMS, correct? We looked at RMS and we said that RMS is a way of doing this scheduling, all right? Now, what is the significance of RMS is that if we used fixed priority assignment, that means all the tasks have a fixed priority and they're all periodic in nature. And then if I look at all the different possible ways in which I can schedule the task, okay? So if I say n tasks, I have n factorial different ways of scheduling. Okay, so if I have 3 tasks, T1, T2, T3, then I have 6 different ways of sort of scheduling the 3 tasks. Okay, so these are 6 different ways. Okay, now the significance is if any of these 6 combinations, I can get some or one or two of them to be proven to be a feasible schedule. That means I can take the sequence and I will not miss any deadline. Then RMS will be either of them. Okay, so what we are saying is if I just take any number of tasks, all right, and I just randomly try, okay, which one should be high, which one should be medium, which one should be low priority, and then I draw out the sequence and try out all the different possibilities. And if let's say I find 2 possible entries in this table that produce a feasible schedule, that means I do not miss any deadline. Okay, what we are saying is RMS will definitely be one of this. Okay, so RMS is guaranteed to be one of it. So because of this, we can say that if I already start off using RMS, okay, you are guaranteed to pick one of these possible scheduling approaches that can work for your system. All right, so that is the significance of RMS. Now, let's look at the analysis, okay, from a bit more mathematical perspective. So just now what we have been doing is we have been trying to draw the timing blocks and see where the different tasks will fit in, where the periods will come and so on. Okay, now let's look at it from the a bit more mathematical perspective. Okay, so the analysis that we said just now is trying to predict the worst case behavior, all right, of a system and see that if I have this worst case behavior, can I still meet the timing constraints on the system? Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So the first thing that we need to look at is the schedulability of a task. Okay, so what is the schedulability of a task? Okay, the schedulability of a task is this formula here, which is basically the what you call the utilization. So the utilization of a periodic task tells us what fraction of the processor time I'm actually using in a particular task. All right, so we say that each task has a certain period and I use up a certain amount of time from that period. Okay, so in this case, okay, I have 5 units of time, okay, as a period, but out of the 5 units, I use up 2 units. Okay, similarly over here, I have 4 units for the period, and out of the 4 units I use up 1, and so on. So to know the utilization of a periodic task set, all I need to do is to sum up the computation time, okay, or the worst case execution time divided by the period, okay, for each task and add them up together. All right, and basically what this tells us is, am I able to use the processor, okay, to satisfy all the needs of the task in the system. All right, and for that, I I need to satisfy this condition that u must be less than equals to 1. Okay, so this is what we call a necessary condition. Okay, when you say it's necessary means you must have it. Okay, the moment your u is greater than 1, that means what? That means you actually want more computing time for the task which you do not have. Okay, you need more computing time for the task that you do not have. So it is not able, the system will not be able to meet the timing deadlines that you have. All right, so that is the important thing you must first understand. U less than equals to 1 is a necessary condition. That means your utilization must be lesser than or equal to 1, which is 100% of the CPU. Okay, so it must be satisfied. Then only we can talk about the next step, which is the feasible schedule. Okay, so if this condition is not met, okay, there is no way you can come up with some schedule to fulfill anything. All right, it will not work. Okay, but so this is where you must understand the English terminology. So this is what you call a necessary condition, but it is not a sufficient condition. Okay, so necessary means it's a must have. Okay, it's a must have. Okay, but when you say it's not a sufficient condition means it's not enough to say that just because I satisfy this condition, I can definitely have a way to schedule it. All right, so it can be a situation where you can satisfy this condition, but yet you still cannot find a feasible schedule for the task that you have. Okay, so this is one example. All right, so if you look at these two tasks, T1 and T2, if I compute the utilization, that means 205 plus 407, okay, okay, you will get 34 over 35, okay, which is lesser than equals to 1. So it definitely fulfills the necessary condition. Okay, it fulfills the necessary condition. But just because it fulfills that condition, okay, which is this, doesn't mean it can be schedulable. Okay, why? So if I were to draw the timing deadline out, okay, if I say task 1 is higher priority, right, because the period is shorter, okay, what will happen is at time t equals to 5, okay, another instance of T1 will have to run, correct, because T1 is higher priority. Okay, but because of that, your task 2 gets preempted. So task 2 has 4 units of computation time, but you only completed 3 units before the deadline was there. Okay, so I will miss the T2 deadline. Okay, if I try the other way, okay, since it's only 2 tasks, if I try the other way, T2 has higher priority, okay, and then T1 is launched after that, then what will happen? T1 will miss the deadline. Okay, so you can see that whichever way I choose, I will always miss the deadline for one of the tasks, even though my utilization is lesser than 1. Okay, so the utilization lesser than 1, okay, is a necessary condition, okay, as mentioned here, but it is not a sufficient condition. So it's not enough to say that just because u is less than equals to 1, you can definitely schedule it. No, okay, you still need to do other things. Okay, so that is what we just said just now, where a task set may or may not be schedulable under fixed priority. Okay, now what is the next thing we can do? Okay, we can use the RMS approach to check for schedulability, where we assign priorities based on RMS and then we check for the hyper period. If no deadline is missed during hyper period, then we can say that it's definitely schedulable. Okay, so in this case, if I take the RMS approach, okay, and in the RMS approach, I see that I will miss the deadline for T2. I can say for sure that this task set is not schedulable. Okay, so that is one way of checking whether, given this task set that we have and the computation time and deadline and so on, whether it is a feasible schedule can be obtained. Okay, so just now we talked about utilization of the processor. Now we talk about another parameter called utilization bound. So what is utilization bound? It is what we call a sufficient but not necessary condition. Okay, so what is sufficient? Sufficient means if I can satisfy this condition, okay, then that is enough to say that the task set can definitely be schedulable under a fixed priority scheme. All right, so this is the formula to say that this is to calculate the utilization bound. Okay, and interestingly, even though it is sufficient, it is not a necessary condition. So I don't need to satisfy this, but if I satisfy this, I can say for sure that it is schedulable. Okay, so let's look at some example. Okay, so this n is basically the number of tasks. So n is the number of tasks. So this table here already gives you the pre-calculated values if you substitute 1 or 2 or 5 or anything inside this n here. Okay, so you can use this table, okay, for your calculation. You don't need to manually calculate it one by one. All right, this table already gives you those answers. Now let's look at an example here where we have two tasks. Okay, task 1 and task 2 with computation time and period given here. So since we have two tasks, we look at the value for 2. Okay, where n is 2. So the value for the utilization bound is 0.828. Okay, now what is the utilization? Utilization means I must compute the value of computation time over period. That means this is 1 over 2 plus 1 over 3. Correct, that will give me 0.8333. Okay, and as you can see, that value is bigger than 0.828. Okay, so what do you see here? You see that on one side this is lesser than equals to 1, so I satisfy the utilization requirement. Okay, but I do not satisfy the utilization bound. It is still greater than utilization bound. Okay, but if I take the RMS approach and I draw out the timing blocks, I can see that it is schedulable. Okay, based on the RMS approach. Okay, where T1 is higher priority and T2 is lower priority. Okay, so this gives you an idea of where we are right now. Okay, so the first thing is, okay, it takes some time to get used to the terminology. All right, the utilization, the moment is greater than 1, we can say for sure that it is not schedulable. No need to check anything else. Okay, if the utilization is less than equals to 1, that necessary condition is satisfied. Okay, this is definitely a must. Okay, utilization must be less than equals to 1. But when we are in this range, we can only say that it may or may not be schedulable. We can't say for sure. Okay, then comes the utilization bound. Okay, so if the utilization bound is satisfied, then you can say that the sufficient condition has been satisfied, so it is definitely schedulable. Okay, so the schedulability analysis is now for task set that meet the necessary condition but not the sufficient condition. That means this here. That means now we are trying to look at this orange block here. That means those task set that satisfy this necessary condition, but the utilization is still greater than utilization bound. Okay, so that is the kind of analysis we're going to do right now. Okay, so what we can do is, okay, so given this task set over here, T1, T2, T3, okay, So the priority is based on RMS, correct? So this is based on the RMS. So the lowest priority, lowest period, which is T1 has the highest priority, followed by T2 and followed by T3. And then we look at the utilization bound. So this B1, B2, B3 is from the table. Okay, this is from the utilization bound table. Okay, so now if I look at the utilization of these three tasks, this 0.952, that I get by computing the 40 over 100 plus 40 over 150 plus 100 over 350. So that will give me 0.952. So the utilization is greater than the utilization bound, okay, of 0.779. So it does not meet the sufficient condition. So what we do is we look at it one by one. Okay, let's look at task 1, task 2, task 3, and then progressively we build up and see what happens. Okay, so if I just look at task 1 alone, task 1 alone means I only have one task in the system. So for that, the utilization will be 40 over 100, which is 0.4. And that is lesser than B1. So if I just have task 1, just a single task, definitely it is schedulable. How about two tasks? So this is 40 over 100 for the first task, 40 over 150 for the second task. And that will give me 0.667, which is less than equals to B2, which is 0.828. So if I have task 1 and task 2, then it is still lesser than the utilization bound, so definitely schedulable. Correct? Now when I add task 3, then only the utilization bound condition is not satisfied. Okay, but as we said just now, the utilization bound test is just because you fail the test doesn't mean you cannot be schedulable. It may still be schedulable. Okay, so we still need to do some other steps, which is what we are doing now here. So to know whether it is still schedulable, all right, what we need to look at is the idea of the critical instant. Okay, the critical instance is basically the point of time where when I release the task, I will have to have the largest response time. Okay, and when does this happen? If I release a task at the same time when all the higher priority tasks are also released. All right, so let's look at this. So I have three tasks here. Okay, T1, T2, T3, T4 with the 4 different priorities. Okay, task 1 being the highest priority. Now, when I look at this and all of them are released at the same time, okay, let's say this is T equals to 0, then what happens? All the higher priority tasks will automatically take more importance over the lowest priority task. So the lowest priority task T4 will now have the largest response time. Okay, because I need to wait for all the higher priority tasks to complete and free up some time for the lowest priority task to carry on and finish its activity. So this is something similar to we're going to apply that thinking over to this example here, where we have the same T1, T2, T3, and we can say that T3 is this point here is basically the point where is the critical instance for T3. Okay, why? Because at that point of time, when T3 is released, T1 is also released, T2 is also released. Okay, and T1 and T2 are having a higher priority than T3. Okay, so how do I compute this, go about this critical analysis? What I need to do is I need to look at all the computation demands from all higher priority tasks at each point of time. Okay, and then see whether I can meet the deadline. Okay, so let's put this here. Now, if I look at this example here, what do you see? You see that here I have T1 launched here, T1 here, T1 here, and T1 here. Correct? That means 4 instances of T1 have been launched, okay, or been released. Okay, 3 instances of T2 have been released, and 1 instance of T3 has been released. Okay, So what I need to do is, since the deadline of task T3 is 350, okay, I look at all the instances, the computational demands of all the higher priority tasks at that point of time. Okay, and this is what we call the interference. And I add it with the computational demand of the task and see whether it is still within the deadline. All right. So now we see that at this point of time, I have 4 instances of T1, 2 instances of T2. And this is basically what we call the interference. Okay, why is it interference? Because in a sense, it is interfering with the completion of task T3, correct? Because this T1 and T2 is considered a higher priority task that is not interfering with task 3 being completed. Okay, so that is basically what is shown here. All right, so I have total interference of this 4 instances of, this is 3 instances of T2, 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so 4 instances of T1, okay, and 3 instances of T2. Okay, and I add up everything is 280. So this 280 is the total amount of time that is required, okay, but the higher priority task. Okay, so that is the interference. That is the interference. So the interference plus the computational demands of C3. So how much time does C3 need? It takes another 100 units of time. All right. So the total amount of time that is needed to fulfill the needs of T1 and T2 and T3 is actually 380. Okay, and this is bigger than the period of 350. Okay, so you can see that based on this analysis, we can say that T3 is going to miss the deadline. Correct? Because within the time instance of 350, what is happening is the demands of T1 and T2 already add up to 280. Correct? Plus the requirement for another 100 units of time for T3, which is adds up to 380, and that will be bigger than the period of T3. Okay, so of course, when you look at it in this case, in this analysis, you tend to see that it is not schedulable. Okay, but let's look at it in a bit more detailed manner to understand whether is it really schedulable or not. Now, if you now take into account all the free time slots that you have, okay, what do you see? You see that for task 1, okay, I take 40 units of time here. Correct. And the moment I complete task 1 40 units, I will go to task 2 40 units. So after T1 and T2, okay, complete 40 and 40, I actually have a gap of 20 units because the next instance of T1 will only come at 100. Correct. So this gap here, this is 80. So I can set aside 20 units of time for T3. Okay, similarly, after that, once T1 completes, okay, I have another 10 units of time here. So this is 140, and this will only be 150 because the period of T2 is 150. So I got another 10 units of time here. Okay, and when it finishes at 190, again, I got another 10 units of time because the T1 will only come back at 200. Okay, and after T1 completes here, I take another 40 units of time here. Okay, I will come back again at 300, and that is also where T2 will also have another instance. Correct. So from 240 all the way to 300, I have another 60 units of time here. Okay, so you can see that if I now look into all the gaps of free slots that I have, all of this add up to 100, which is actually what I need. Right, it's actually what I need to make sure that T3 can be completed before the deadline. In fact, T3 can be completed even before the deadline at 300 itself. Correct, not even 350. By 300 itself, I can actually fulfill the needs of task 3. So what went wrong? Okay, why is it just now when we analyze, we say cannot, but yet when we look at all these gaps, it seems that it can be done. Okay, so the issue is, all right, we are checking based on the 350, which is the period or the deadline of the task 3. Okay, so because we are checking at 350, all right, what happens is I am actually going to calculate in this and this. That means I'm going to take in one additional T1 and one additional T2 in my total computational time requirement or the interference requirement. All right, but rightfully I didn't need to include this too, because at time t equals to 300 already I fulfill the needs of the whole system. So to solve this issue, we need to look at more points. We need to check at more points. All right, and what are the more points? We need to check at all the periodic intervals of all the lower level tasks. Okay, at all the lower level tasks. So we need to check at 100, 150, 200, 300, 350, and so on. Okay, and at each of these times, we need to check whether the demand is less than equals to the capacity. All right, so that is what we need to do to make sure that we are able to take into account all these free slots before we start a new instance of another task. Okay, so if you look at it at the timing interval perspective, at time t equals to 100, okay, you can see that T1, T2, T3. So this is 1 T1, 1 T2, and 1 T3. Okay, at time t equals 150, you have 2 T1, 1 T2, and 1 T3. Okay, so at each point of time, what we are doing is we are looking at the time required and the deadline at that time, which is the period or elapsed time at that time. All right, and we can see that for each of these time intervals, we are exceeding the demand is exceeding the time that we have used so far. But at time t equals to 300, we are able to see that they are both the same. That means the total computational time required is lesser than equal to the amount of time that we have just consumed. Okay, so it is possible that T3 is schedulable at t equals to 300. Okay, so this is where the schedulability test comes in. Okay, so that schedulability test has some formulas here. All right, I will skip these formulas. Okay, we'll just go to the example here, and then you can relate how it works. All right, so the way you apply is very easy. You just need to take the computation time for each task. So this is T1, T2, and T3. So this is the computation time. And what we do is when we want to test for any particular time instance T. So if I want to test for time T equals to 300, then the numerator here is 300 and the denominator here is the period. So this is the time that we are checking. And we are checking. Okay, and this is the period of the task. Okay, and I just multiply. Okay, when I do a division, I take the ceiling. Okay, and I see whether that value here, all right, is it lesser than or equal to the actual t that we are comparing against. Okay, and if that condition is satisfied, then we can say that we are able to schedule the task without missing any deadlines within that t that we have. Okay, so now you can see that we are now looking at a more detailed analysis to understand whether a task set is schedulable given this approach of testing at various intervals, okay, of the entire periodic nature of the task. Okay, so that is basically how we can do all the fixed scheduling. Now let me just finish up this last set of slide and then we can go for a break. So this last few set of slide is just on the other approach of scheduling, which we call the dynamic priority scheduling. Okay, so in dynamic priority scheduling, okay, basically what is happening is okay, so in dynamic priority scheduling, this is one technique where we say is earliest deadline first. So in EDF scheduling, the task with the earliest deadline automatically has the highest priority. Okay, so the priority will be updated as and when a new task instance is released. All right, so let's look at an example, then we see how it works. Okay, so in this example here, we have T1 and T2. So in EDF, basically we are saying that the highest priority task will always get to run first. All right, based on the deadline. Okay, so the deadline is the way in which we will decide the priority. So let's look at this. So you have T1 and T2. T1's deadline is 4, T2's deadline is 10. So at time t equals to 0, okay, at time t equals to 0, what happens is when both the tasks are launched together, T1 will have the higher priority. Correct? So when T1 is completed, then T2 can run. Okay, and T2 has a computation time of 5 units over here. Okay, but before I can finish the 5 units, okay, what will happen is you will get preempted because the another instance of T1 comes. So when another instance of T1 comes, why do we have a preemption here? Because at this point of time, okay, at this point of time, the scheduler will see that I have T2 and T1 is now being released. But T2's deadline is 6 units away, whereas T1's deadline will be 4 units away. All right, because for T1 deadline is 8, T2's deadline is 10. Okay, so since T1's deadline is earlier, so the T1 will have a higher priority, so the preemption will take place. So after T1 has completed, then T2 will carry on, and when time t equals to 8, what happens? Okay, another instance of T1 is supposed to be released here. Okay, another instance of T1 is supposed to be released here. Okay, but because at that point of time, okay, T2's deadline is 2 units away. Because at time t equals to 8, T2's deadline is 2 units away, whereas T1's deadline is 4 units away. So T2's deadline is going to come first. Okay, so T1 will run, T2 will run to completion first, and then T1 will run. Okay, similarly, at time t equals to 10, what happens? Another instance, because T2 period is 10. All right, so another instance of T2 is supposed to be released. Okay, but T1 is already running, all right, and T1's deadline is at that point of time is 2 units away. All right, whereas T2's instance will be 10 units away. So definitely T1 will have a higher priority. So T1 will carry on to run, and then T2 will come in. Okay, and at time t equals to 12, what happens? Another instance of T1 is to be released. All right, so when T1 is supposed to be released here, you will see that for T1, the deadline is supposed to be 4 units away. For T2, it is 8 units away. Okay, so because of that, the preemption will happen and T1 will run. Okay, and after that, T2 will carry on running. Now, at time t equals to 16 is where you see that another instance of T1 is to be released over here, and T2 is still running. All right, but at time t equals to 16, you will see that for both the tasks, the deadline is now the same, because for both of them at time t equals 16, the deadline is t equals to 20. So since both of them have the same deadline, the priority is the same. So since T2 is already running, T2 will carry on to run, okay, and then finish and T1 will run. Okay, so this is another example, or this is an example of what we call the dynamic scheduling algorithm. That means your scheduler is able to change the priority of tasks dynamically as the system is running. All right, so this again depends on the scheduler policy and how it works. All right, so in this EDF, okay, we call it optimal scheduling analysis, optimal scheduling policy. That means as long as I can satisfy this condition that utilization was going to be less than or equals to 1, you can say that the EDF will always produce a feasible schedule. Okay, so with dynamic priority, as long as the utilization is less than equals to 1, that is already a necessary and sufficient condition. Okay, so that is the EDF optimality sort of a policy. Okay, so that basically brings us to the end of this set of slides, okay, where we have introduced some concept of scheduling algorithms and how it works. Okay, and like I mentioned just now, some of the analysis is based on some assumptions, all right, in terms of the periodic nature of tasks and dependency between one task and another task, which may or may not hold true for our project and some aspects of it. Okay, but the concepts are important so that you, when you are learning other OS and talking about other scheduling algorithms, you know how to apply these concepts. Okay. Okay. So before we go for a break, just a few admin matters. So for the project budget, as I mentioned before, each team has $50, okay, to spend. Okay, you must keep your receipt, okay, before you must keep the receipt till the end. Only when the semester has ended, I will send you all the, I mean not the semester, when the exams are over, all right, I will send you all the documents, okay, to fill up and submit the claims, okay. And you have to do a single person in the group must submit a claim only for that group. Okay, so you cannot combine uh, groups to make a big claim. Okay, so you cannot say that, oh, my friend buying for me, so we just put it together as two groups. No, so you have to make sure that each group purchases its own stuff and submits its own claim. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is this hardware components replacement. So along the way, while you are, especially in these few weeks, while you're building up your hardware, things may get spoiled, may get damaged, and so on. Okay, so most of the general stuff, okay, we can replace. Okay, again, it can't be every week you keep spoiling the same thing. All right, so once a while, if you have spoiled your Bluetooth chip, okay, or your driver chip, and so on, okay, we can do a one-to-one exchange. That is not an issue. The only thing, like I said, we do not have the luxury of replacing is the freedom board. So that part you need to be very careful about it. Okay, so another thing that I just saw recently is that the App Inventor has actually been released for the iOS platform. Okay, I do not have a iOS device with me to test. Okay, so if you have uh, uh, those of you who have, please do try it out, okay, and see whether it sort of works with whatever code you're currently building. If it does, please let me know, okay, then I can share with the rest of the class. Okay, so that will also be a good news, okay, for you all, okay, so that you can also port it over for the iOS platform. Okay, so those of you who have a iPhone or what, you know, you can try it out and see whether your code base works with without any issues on the iOS device. Okay, so do keep me posted. Okay, those of you who have iPhone. Okay, so some important announcements regarding the midterm. Okay, so next week will be the midterm. Okay, topics covered will be 1 to 10. All right, which is everything excluding the lecture 6 on analog interfacing, which we did not cover. All right, but I gave you the slides just for reference. Tutorials 1 to 4, labs 1 to 6. Okay, it's a closed book quiz with a single A4 double-sided hard copy reference sheet. Okay, plus a soft copy KL25Z data sheet. All right. You are not allowed to reference the online RTX documentation. So whatever that you think you need to copy down, you can put it in the reference sheet. All right, and you are only allowed to use a single computing device. Okay, plus your handphone for the Zoom proctoring. So very similar to I think what you have been doing all this while. So nothing new. Okay. The format will be MCQ. More details on the number of questions and everything I will send you all, but it'll be only MCQ questions. Okay. No, nothing else. Okay. So I will leave this slide here. Okay, for you all to just have a look and think of any questions you want to ask me. So we'll just go for a short. Yeah, you can bring along some uh, rough working paper if you want, okay, to take down, do any calculations or whatever. Okay, so that is fine. Okay, so let's go for a short break. Okay, about 5 minutes break. Okay, now it's 11:10. 11:15. Let's come back. Okay, I just want to go through the first part of the next topic, which is on Mutex, so that you are able to uh, complete the lab portion for this week. Okay, so we'll just take a short break and we'll come back to go to the next chapter. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the next set of slides is on concurrency. Okay, so there are two parts to it, mutex and semaphore. All right, so I'm just going to go through the first part on mutex. Okay, the semaphore part we will have more discussion the next lecture. Okay, so before we go there, just a quick update on the project challenge. So the maze challenge one is the same as before. All right, so the last batch, whatever they did is about the same. Okay, so basically what you need to do is your robot needs to go from the start point, all right, through up the ramp, come down, go around. So all these triangles are cones, okay, which Uncle Jalil has. If you want to borrow from him, you can just ask. Okay, they are all in the lab. Okay, and then you have to come back through another ramp and then do a figure 8 before coming back to the end point here. Okay, these distances and all are not very. You don't need to be too particular about it because this is still what we call the remote control phase. Correct? You are still performing the remote control of the device. So as long as you are able to control it well, I think there is no issue. For the RAM, okay, I will ask Uncle Jalil to set up some of these RAMs on the DSA in the DSA lab, so you can actually do some testing on your own. Okay, so this RAM proved to be a killer for many students, especially when it sort of commits suicide. Okay, before it reaches the top. Okay, and then your heart drops, and then your heart keeps beating faster and faster because you're trying to quickly put everything back together and carry on with the race. Okay, so do try to have sufficient testing. Okay, in the past, students have tried to put uh, some sort of rubber tape and so on the tires to give a better grip. Okay, so it's up to you. You can try some techniques if you want to improve the grip so that it doesn't sort of fall off and things like that. So that is something you can explore. So we will set up these these ramps for you in the DSA lab to start testing. Okay, so that is for you to get prepared. Okay, the new element is this challenge 2, where you're supposed to operate in what we call a self-driving mode. So in self-driving mode, your robot will start within a grid space of 60 by 60 centimeter, and you will have to just move straight towards an obstacle. So this is actually one of the red cones. Again, I will ask Uncle Jalil to place these cones out in the lab so you can see it for yourself. Okay, and what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to go towards the cone by itself, go around it, okay, and come back. Okay, so this is a fixed size sort of cone, all right, and the whole thing has to be done in auto mode. Okay, and the key thing is you're not allowed to place any form of markers or on the floor to indicate any position of the obstacle. All right, so you need to use the budget to buy and attach any sensors that you would like to use, all right, on your robot to detect this obstacle. And then from there you can go around. To go around, you can do the hard code. Okay, you cannot hard code the distance to stop. Okay, so this distance to stop is this part here. That means from here all the way to here. So this part you cannot hard code and say, okay, I move a certain amount and I stop. No. Okay, you must be able to detect. But going around the obstacle, that one you can hard code. Okay, and once you go around, you're supposed to come back in. Okay, and once you come back in, there will be another cone placed here at the back of this, at the end of this grid space here for you to stop. Okay, so that is the second challenge. So the whole thing is in what we call self-driving mode. So you only need to press a single button on your app, for example, and then you just say start, and then the whole thing is supposed to run by itself. All right, so that is the maze challenge 2. All right, so again, just understand the functionality first and then start to think about the implementation, the ideas, and so on. All right, okay, so for now, focus on what you already know and build up that first. Okay, in terms of the OS, architecture, and how to put everything together, that part, don't think too much first because we still haven't covered that material. All right, so focus on the things that you already know, the motor control, the audio, the Bluetooth interface, the serial, and all this stuff. So all of that, make sure it's up and running and you have it in a proper framework. And then while we are learning about the OS, I will give you some ideas as well, how we can put everything together, and then you have the whole system in place. Okay. Okay, so for this chapter, basically, okay, these first few slides here are just to give you the idea of how systems can be designed at the architecture level. So we're just giving you some idea to show you that, okay, we have this concept of single instruction, single data. That means every time I fetch an instruction, I fetch some data and then I do the processing, which is what we know we're comfortable with. Okay, you can also design architecture where you have multiple instructions with a single data. So I fetch a single data, but a few different instructions might work on it at the same time. Or single instruction, multiple data streams. Okay, so one instruction work with a lot of data at the same time. All right, and multiple instruction, multiple data. All right, so this is again very much related to computer architecture hardware, okay, which we are not covering, but it gives you the idea that okay, you can have these kind of different systems in place for specific niche areas. Okay, so if you are dealing with, let's say, graphics, image and audio processing and so on, so those kind of chips may have different kind of hardware configurations to give them that additional edge, okay, in terms of processing and dealing with that kind of data. All right. So what we are interested in is operating systems on single processor cores like our KL25Z. Okay. And of course, in this kind of scenarios, it's easier in terms of memory management and also the scheduling policy. Now, what is the key thing between single thread and multiple thread? Okay. When you have a single threaded application, okay, if you look at this example, when I have a line of code, okay, so if I have my main code here, and inside that code, okay, let's say this is variable I. If I try to update a value into I, all right, so that single thread is updating memory, all right. But in a multi-threaded context, of course, you have T1, okay, and then you have T2 and so on, okay. So each task, okay, each of them may try to update I, okay, each of them may try to update I. Then we need to be very careful because uh, when one task is expecting a value of I, another task may have overwritten it. Okay, but this same problem also exists in single threaded because of what? In a single threaded application, you can still have a problem where somebody else may update the same variable I, correct? So who is that? Anybody can tell me? Yeah, correct. It's interrupt. All right. So because interrupts are also not sequential in your processing, correct? I mean, in your flow of code. So you do not know when that will happen. All right. So even though your function may be depending on I, and I may be a shared variable, then you also have a problem with the interrupt updating I. If let's say your main program or your main loop also is trying to read from I. Okay. So that is issue that we need to deal with. Of course, in multi-threaded, it becomes even more glaring because you have many tasks that can all try to read and write to a common buffer at the same time. Okay, so in concurrent access, okay, what will happen is you have this issue of what you call a race condition, where the results of the computation, okay, can vary depend on the way in which the multi-threading actually happens. Okay, so the same code, okay, but every time you run it, you may get a different answer, okay, because of the way the multi-threading was happening. Okay, and this is an issue because if your results of the computation are not consistent, then it's very difficult for you to go to the next step. Correct, you do not know whether the data is correct or is it corrupted and so on. So let's look at this example here to understand this race condition a bit better. So here I have uh, a common global variable k, and increment k is a function which is used by multiple processors. So function A and function B are both tasks. Okay, so OS track new function A and function B. That means both function A and function B, think of them as two tasks. And inside both of these tasks, I call the same common function, which is increment k. Okay, so what will happen? So when we say increment k, which is k equals to k plus 1, okay, in C, we say that it is a single line of execution. All right, but of course, when you compile the code, it gets compiled into assembly language instruction. All right, and in a RISC system like ARM, okay, so RISC stand for what? You all should know this, correct? RISC stand for anybody? Yeah, reduced instruction set computer, correct? The other one is CISC. Okay, so it all depends on the architecture of the processor we are using. So for a RISC system, basically how it works is you have instructions that are very targeted towards fulfilling a certain objective. That means if I say I load from memory to my register, that is a single operation. If I do arithmetic or logical operation, that is a single uh, sort of operation I want to carry out. So every instruction has a very specific targeted objective to fulfill. In a CISC system, your instructions can be very complex. Okay, that means your instructions, you can say that I read from memory A and memory B, do an addition and write back to a memory, everything in one instruction. Okay, so it's a very, you can write very complex instructions in a single line. Okay, for those kind of processes. Okay, whereas RISC is very focused and targeted. Okay, so the first thing is you must understand that this in C will translate to a few instructions in assembly. So in assembly, first I need to do the fetch, which is taking the data from the memory and store it to a local register. Because for RISC systems, you cannot directly manipulate content in memory. You need to move that content. So K is a variable in memory, correct? Okay, but in order to manipulate the data inside this memory location, I first need to take a copy of that data into my internal register. So that is the fetch comes in. So I fetch the data from the memory into my internal register. Then I execute it. Because of course you do the decoding, then you do the execution, which is to increment. And then finally you do the write back. The write back is to take the register content and put it back into memory. All right, so I need to do these three steps at the assembly level to complete this instruction in C. So let's look at what will happen. So in a single step over here, single process, okay, this is what is happening. At first, I load the value into my internal register, I increment it, and then I store back. So this one is easy for us to see, correct? Now, how about when I have two tasks running? Okay, so you can think of it as two cores or two tasks running. So when I have two tasks running, okay, uh, you if my initial value is k equals to 0, okay, if I run this increment k 2 times, I expect my k value to become 2 at the end of it. Okay, so that is if I follow this sequence, correct? That means first is 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3, followed by 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3. Or the other way is 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and then 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. Okay, that means one task does this entire sequence complete, then the other task does the entire sequence complete. Okay, so if everything happens like this, of course, you will have two levels of increment, and when k equals to 0, at the end of everything, it will become k equals to 2. Correct? So here, k is equals to 0. At the end of the first sequence, k is equals to 1, and over here, k is equals to 2. Similarly here, k is equals to 0, k is equals to 1, and then k is equals to 2. Okay, what if now there is some interleaving? Okay, so assuming that first 1.1 does, that means the first task takes the current value, okay, copies it into the internal register, then increments the value. So currently the initial value that I take is k is equals to 0. So when I increment, it becomes k equals to 1. Okay, but before I can write back, at this point of time, there is a interruption of the task, and I switch over from task 1 to task 2. Okay, so when task 2 loads the k value, it is still loading a value of 0. Okay, and then it increments, so k equals to 1. And then after that, I go back to task 1 and write back. So when I write back, k is equals to 1 because task 1's update value is 0 to 1. And then finally, when task 2 write back, it also write back the same thing, k is equals to 1. Okay, so you can see that when I have a race condition like this where the sequence was interrupted, then the outcome becomes different. Okay, it's wrong. Okay, so this is tricky, correct? Because uh, results may be incorrect only sometimes. All right, and these are the kind of bugs that can be very, very difficult to catch. All right, because you run it 10 times, and out of that 9 times it seems correct, and suddenly one time is wrong, and then you can't figure out what went wrong. All right, because everything seems correct. Okay, so it all depends on the precise timing relationship between the processes. So it's like by luck. Okay, if you happen to catch this bug, it's good. All right, then you know something is wrong, then you can go and fix it. Okay, so how can I prevent something like this in the first place? Okay, how do I eliminate race conditions? Okay, so that is what we are going to be looking at. So to eliminate race condition, we must first understand the concept of what is a critical section of a code. So we say a section of the code is considered critical if it makes access to shared resources. All right, so what we want is we want to make sure that when I have shared resources between task 1 and task 2, so if I have a shared resource, that both of them trying to read from a shared buffer. Okay, so inside my code, maybe this is the part where I update buffer. Okay, and inside my T2, this is where I update buffer. Okay, so as far as I'm concerned, this is basically the critical section of T1, and this is the critical section of T2, because for both of this section of code, I am accessing this shared resource, which is this buffer. Okay, so in order to safely do this access to a shared resource, what we need to do is we need to make sure that the way in which I access this shared resource is mutually exclusive. Okay, so when I say mutually exclusive means you enforce that only one thread can have access at any point of time. Okay, so the moment I try to access it, I sort of put a lock on it. And when I'm done with it, I unlock it. Then another task can take over this shared resource. All right, so this mutual exclusion, okay, allows me to ensure that when one task is using this shared resource, another task cannot use it. Okay, so the concept is quite easy with just having two things, what we call mutex lock and mutex release. Now let's look at this example here. Let's say I have two tasks, thread A and thread B. Okay, and I have a shared resource which is increment K. Okay, which is the same code that we talked about just now. Now, both of these tasks, task A and task B, okay, both of them want to call this function increment K. Okay, but we do not know who is going to run first. Maybe thread A must run first, or maybe thread B might run first. But whichever task run first, what the task must do is it must lock the access. Okay, by calling this function called mutex lock. So the moment I lock this, I lock this resource, okay, and if after that something happens and I have a context switch over to task B, that means task A haven't finished with increment K yet. But before it can finish with increment K, a context switch happened and I went to task B. Okay. And after I go to task B, what does task B try to do? Task B will also try to do a mutex lock, correct? Because it also wants to call increment K. Both task A and task B both want to call increment K. But when task B calls mutex lock, what will happen? The OS will know that another task has already taken the lock. Okay, another task has already taken the lock. So because another task has taken the lock, it will make task B go into a block state. Okay, and once task B go to a block state, it will not be able to carry on and do anything else anymore. Okay, which means that I can now perform a context switch back to task A, and since task A already acquired the lock, it can carry on to perform the critical section, which is increment K. And once I'm done with increment K, then finally I can say mutex release. So when I say mutex release, I unlock. Okay, so when I unlock, what happens? When I unlock, then the OS will come in and see, okay, which task is now waiting for the mutex. Okay, which task is waiting for the mutex. So you can see that the task that is waiting for the mutex is task B. So the moment I release task A, release the mutex, task B will get the mutex. So when task B get the mutex, what will happen is it will transition from block state to which state? Can anybody tell me? Once you get the mutex, which state will it go to? Okay, it will correct. It will go to the ready state. Okay, why? Because it was waiting for a resource, correct? It was waiting for the resource, which is in this case the mutex, and it couldn't get the resource, so it went to a block state. But now that the resource has been released, the OS will now be able to allocate this resource to task B, and task B will now be able to transition from block to ready. Okay, then of course, when it runs depends on the scheduler. Okay, so when it goes to run state depends on the scheduler and whether the other tasks and so on. Okay, but now you can see that the key thing is the mutex helps me to ensure that if one task already locked the mutex, only that task can perform the critical section of the code. Okay, if another task has if this current task gets preempted, another task comes in and tries to do something similar, it will not be able to carry on because the mutex was already locked by another task. Okay, so that is the key thing you must understand. Okay, that concept. Okay, so in terms of RTX implementation is just four lines here. First, you need to create a mutex ID globally. Okay, then you create a new mutex by calling OS mutex new, and to get the mutex or lock is this. So this is equivalent to lock. Okay, mutex acquire and then mutex release. Okay, so these are the only four things that you need to take note of. Okay, so you first need to create a mutex, call OS mutex new, acquire if I want to lock it, and release if I want to, if I'm done with it. Okay, so that is basically the mutex concept. Okay, so the key thing that I want you to understand is this idea that when a task has already locked the mutex, okay, even if there's a context switch and some other task is running, it cannot perform that same critical section of the code without the mutex. Okay, it will go into a block state. All right, so let's see this in action. So you're going to be doing this in the lab. Okay, so I want to show a demo of that, okay, in the code so that you have an idea what is happening. Okay, so here I have two tasks, OS, the LED red thread, LED green thread, okay, and at the same time I've created a mutex. So at the top here I have created this mutex IDT my mutex, okay, and at the same time here in the main I call OS mutex new, okay, and inside both of this code here, okay, LED red thread and LED green thread, okay. So, okay, let's look at the default code first. This is what we have been doing all the while. Okay, the LED control red LED, LED control green. Okay, and the RTX round robin is enabled. Okay, so the context switching is happening for tasks of similar priority. Okay, as what you saw in the lab. Okay, so let's compile this code and run first. Okay, so when we run this code, what is the expected behavior? You should know by now, correct? What color do I expect to see? Can anybody tell me? This is your same code as you have done in the last lab, correct? So what color do we expect to see? Okay. Can anybody tell me? Yeah, it's yellow, correct? Because both LED red and LED green are both running concurrently, correct? So even though there is a delay, correct? What is happening is because both of them are in the same priority, all right, you will have a yellow being displayed here. So both are running sort of concurrently at the same time. So we see both the LEDs sort of on together and off together. Okay, so this part we know. Okay, so let me stop this. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use mutex as a way of controlling the LEDs. Okay, so let's look at it over here. Okay, so what you have here is okay, so here what you have is you have red LED and you have green LED. Okay, and what is going to happen is for both of this code, I say mutex acquire first. Okay, and then I control the LED. Okay, and after that, what do? I say I mutex release. Okay, and of course this happens in a loop. So over here at the same thing is happening. I'm going to say mutex acquire. Okay, then the LED, and then the mutex release. All right, so the code has now been updated. Okay, so instead of directly just controlling LEDs, okay, I'm now saying I acquire the mutex first, control the LEDs, and then I release. Same thing for the green. Okay, acquire the mutex, control the LEDs, and then I release. Okay, so now what do you think will happen? Okay, so you can think about it first and put in your response in the poll. Okay, so both the LED green thread and LED red thread are the same. Only thing is right now they are both controlled with, they have a mutex lock and a mutex release before and after. Okay, so I will stop the poll first. Okay, so about so 79% of you said is red first, red will blink first, followed by green, and I will repeat again and again. Okay, then of course some of you have other thoughts about what will happen. Okay, so let's have a look, okay, on what exactly is going to happen. So it's the same code, only thing is I acquire mutex for red LED, okay, and I release it after that. Same thing, green, and then I release it after that. Okay, so if I run the code, red, okay, followed by green, then red and green and so on. Okay, so majority of you got it right, which is good. So you understand the concept. So what is happening? Okay, why from yellow just now, suddenly when I add in the mutex, it has now become alternate? Because when I acquire the mutex here, what am I doing? I'm effectively putting a lock. All right, so when I put a lock here, okay, when the green LED, so because round robin is enabled, that means whatever is the case, I will at some point of time I will have to switch over the green LED. Okay, so when the green LED comes in and it tries to do this, okay, once it tries to do this, you will know that the mutex has already been locked by another task. Okay, so from here onwards, it will go to a block state. Okay, it will go to a block state, and when it goes to a block state, it cannot carry on running. So the red LED will come back and it will actually finish the entire LED sequence first and release the mutex. Only when it release the mutex, okay, after everything is done, then at this point of time only I can go to a ready state. Okay, so the round robin will no longer happen because, I mean, the round robin will happen initially. But the moment the green LED tries to lock the mutex, it will go to a block state. Okay, and then I'll switch back to the red and I will have to finish everything and unlock the mutex first. I release the mutex. Then only the green LED will be able to run. Okay, so that is the key, the main reason why this behavior is happening. Okay, so basically, okay, what will happen is this, all this cannot happen, okay, until I finish with the entire or when red finishes and I'm able to acquire the mutex, then only I'm able to carry on to control the LED and then I release. Okay, I release the mutex and so on. Okay, so what will happen is when the green LED acquires the mutex, okay, when the green LED acquires the mutex, okay, this red LED, it is still looping, correct? That means after I release the mutex, you'll go back to the beginning, which is you will try to do a mutex acquire. Okay, so when you try to do a mutex acquire, what happen? You will know that it cannot get it because this task already took it. Okay, this task already took it because the moment I released it, it went here. That means this task took the mutex. So when the red LED task does the second iteration of the loop and tries to acquire the mutex, you will then go to a block state. Okay, until some point when this fellow releases, then it can unblock and go to a ready state. Okay, so this thing will happen, okay, alternatively between red LED thread and green LED thread throughout the whole program. Okay, so that is why you see this behavior. Okay, so this part is the understanding. Okay, so you must make sure you understand what is really happening in terms of the switching of the task and what state the task is in. Okay, when I try to acquire and I cannot get it, or when I get it back, and so on. Okay, now let's look at something interesting, okay, and see what happens. Now, we know that the mutex is tied to the LED, correct? That is the objective of creating this mutex. So when I acquire the mutex, I control the LED. Now, let's take the LED green thread and let me comment off this. Okay, so what is happening now is only the LED red thread is taking the mutex, controlling LED and releasing the mutex. Okay, whereas the green LED thread is not at all using the mutex. Okay, both of the mutex line, mutex acquire and mutex release are both commented off. Okay, so can you do a poll again and tell me what is the behavior you expect? Okay, I'll build the code. Okay, think about it. What do you think will happen? Okay, so if you look at the code again, only the red LED thread is controlling the or is acquiring and releasing the mutex. Okay, to control the LED. The green LED is not using the mutex at all. So I'll give you a bit more time to think about it. Okay, so this is very important so that you understand a very important concept of mutex through this example here. Okay, I will end the poll first in the interest of time. Okay, so we have sort of a equal share between two possibilities. One is only red LED blinks, the other is both LED blink together. Okay, then we have some other thoughts as well. Okay, so let's see what happens. Okay, so let's see what happens. So now in this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the code. And what you see is you see the yellow LED blinking. That means basically red and green are blinking together. Okay, red and green are blinking together. So why is that the case? Okay, so of course you may think that something is wrong, correct? Because the mutex is supposed to control the LED, all right? So red LED did it correctly, whereas green LED did not. Then how come it is still controlling the LED? Okay, so this is the very important concept you must understand. The mutex is a software defined tool that the OS gives us. How we use the mutex, for what purpose we use the mutex, is only in the programmer's mind. Okay, that means only you know, when you create the mutex, only you know that I have created this mutex to control the LED. The OS does not know why you create the mutex. The OS just follows the rules. That if somebody asks for the mutex, if it's available, they will get it. If it's not available, they will block. Those are the rules it follows. So as far as the green LED thread is concerned, it is going ahead to directly control the hardware without without using the mutex. Because only you are the one who created this rule in your mind that if I want the LED, if I want to control the LED, I must use the mutex. Correct? It is not OS constraint, it is your own constraint. So if you did not enforce that rule in your code, okay, then the OS cannot help you to do that. Okay, the OS can only enforce the rules of how the mutex is supposed to behave. Okay, so this is the important thing to understand. Only the programmer knows why he created the mutex. Okay, so if you have created a mutex to control the LED, then it is your responsibility to ensure that every time in my code there is an LED access, I must lock and unlock. Okay, so if I don't do this proper lock and unlock, I can still go ahead and execute the code. Okay, and that is where issues like this, where data corruption or some funny manipulation of data will come in, even though it's not intended. Okay, so please understand this very well. The mutex is something you create in software, but the application of it is only in your mind. Okay, only you know that I created a mutex for this particular hardware or this particular resource. So it is your responsibility to ensure that if I want to use this hardware resource or any shared resource, then I must lock and unlock in my code. Okay. Okay, so that is the important concept. Now, the other last thing that I want to demonstrate before we end, just give me just 2 more minutes here, is this. Okay, where I am going to, sorry. Okay, so where LED red thread is going to acquire and release, LED green thread is going to acquire, but it is not going to release. Okay, it's going to acquire, but it's not going to release. Okay, so what do you think will happen? Okay, so again, I launched a poll while I build the code. Okay, so the red, there's no change, it's as before, but the green thread is the one where you will acquire, but you will not release. Okay, so I will just end the polling, okay, because we're almost out of time. So majority of you have chosen this option where you blink red and then green and then you continue to stay in green, okay? So that is majority view. Now let's just quickly run this code and see what happens. Okay, so red, green, and nothing else. Okay, red, green, and nothing else. Okay, so let me reset and run it one more time so you can see. So when I run the code, red will blink one time, green will blink another time, and that's it. Nothing else happens. Okay, so again, why is that so? Okay, because again, the rules of the OS is clear. When I call OS mutex acquire means I want to acquire this mutex. I want to lock this mutex. All right. Of course, the thinking would be that since LED green thread already acquired the mutex, it should be still available to LED green thread. Yes, it is still available. But the thing is, you have now tried to call it one more time while you still have it. So as far as the OS is concerned, the way the OS behaves is, I'm now trying to acquire this mutex again. All right. So it does not factor in that you are the one who last took it. It looks at it as what is the activity you want to carry out now. You want to lock this mutex. Okay. But as far as the OS is concerned, this mutex has already been locked. Okay. So since I'm trying to lock it one more time, okay, I will now go into a block state. Okay. So what will happen is over here, okay, after it acquire the resource, okay, it finishes, okay, it does not release. So it never releases the mutex. So if it never releases the mutex after it finishes the LED, what happens? Okay, so if it never releases the mutex, firstly, this task which is blocked will always remain in block state, correct? And inside my code, what happened? I will look back to do one more acquire. So the next time that I try to do a mutex acquire here, it will also go into a block state because it is already considered acquired, and then you try to do another acquire. So what will happen is eventually both the tasks are blocked indefinitely. So that is why you see that there is no more LED blinking. Okay, so there are some variations to this behavior. All right, if you look at the OS mutex attributes. All right, so I will send you all a link to a video I've created to explain this, some other concepts of mutex, so that you can have some other better understanding. But I'm just showing you some of the use cases that you should not follow. That means you should not have tasks trying to where one task follows the rule of lock and unlock, the other task doesn't do it, then you lock but you forget to unlock. These are things you should not do. All right, so you should always follow the proper use rule base, which is I have a resource, I have a mutex, so every time I must make sure I lock and I release before and after. So that is the proper way of always doing it. So I'm just trying to show you the other use cases, but you should not do this in your code. Okay. Okay, so this is considered one instance only, correct? Because as far as the mutex acquire is concerned, when you call OS mutex acquire, you are trying to acquire this mutex. It means this resource, correct? So this resource is only a single resource which was already acquired. So the OS will look at the status of this resource and say that it has already been acquired. So you cannot acquire it now. So I have to put you to a block state. Okay, so that is why it will automatically put it into a block state. Okay, but like I said, there is one variation to this, which is the recursive mode of mutex acquire. Okay, so that part I will explain in the video. That is just for your understanding on how it can work. All right, but again, these are things generally not used. Okay, and we should not implement it and complicate our code. All right, so this is the proper way of doing it, and we should follow this approach. Okay, so I think I've already exceeded my time. So thank you. So this week, Slabs is on the mutex. All right, and the tutorial, I think what I've gone through today can help you to answer some questions. Okay, so I know some of you may think, okay, we just complete the lecture, but your tutorial later. Okay, you do not need to worry about getting the correct answers in the tutorial discussion. As long as you participate, you get some discussions with your tutor, you will get your participation marks. All right, so you do not need to give a solution or give a correct answer or anything. So just get involved in the tutorial to clear your doubts, to ask questions and get a better understanding. All right, I think that is enough. That is all we are looking for. Okay, you don't need to have a solution and a proper answer. All right, so so I have the tutorial later to reinforce these concepts, and in the Friday's lab you will have the you will try this in the lab also on Friday. Okay, so thank you very much. Okay, and I will see you all next week for the midterm. Okay, so thank you. Bye.